Brussels, the de facto capital of European politics and the unofficial seat of the European Parliament, the EU's lawmaking body. It's the only EU institution where representatives of member states, the MEPs, are directly elected by millions of EU citizens every 5 years. Put simply, it helps create EU laws, it supervises the spending of the bloc's multi-billion-pound budget, and it scrutinises all community activities. But after voting for Brexit in 2016, British politicians had expected to vacate their seats in the Parliament at the end of this 5-year cycle. So why is Britain and Gibraltar taking part? With a Brexit date pushed back until October, Britain is legally obliged to offer its citizens the right to democratic representation in Europe, even if it's only for a few months. So what's the mood in Brussels following this unexpected turn of events? I went along to find out. The European Union has 3 working places. Its official seats in Strasbourg, there's Luxembourg, and there's here in Brussels. Now, it's pretty empty at the moment because most of the MEPs are in their own countries and constituencies campaigning for the elections. There's 751 MEPs at the moment. They represent some 500 million citizens all over Europe, but that's set to drop down to 705 post-Brexit. After India, this is the biggest election in the world. So Georg, here we are at the Vox Box. It's the media centre, if you like, with the European Union's campaign video playing in the background. What do you think of voter engagement this time around? You've been here around 10 years. What do you think it'll be like this time?
Well, I think there is a lot of interest in this election, even before the UK now looking as though it's going to be taking part. But even before that, there are so many issues going on in Europe at the moment. There's questions about the rise of the right in Finland, in Spain, in a great number of countries. There's also the centre-left performing quite well in recent elections, and centre-right parties struggling in some countries. So there are a lot of issues in play in each country. And then, of course, added into that mix, we've got the whole question now about Brexit. The UK suddenly electing MEPs for Gibraltar, but maybe only for a couple of months. It's a really strange election. I think people are watching it really closely. I don't know what the turnout's going to be. We'll have to see what happens there, but I think certainly it's one to watch.
You work here day in, day out. You speak to a lot of people. What's the undercurrent here about Brexit? How do people view it? I mean, are they fearful of how it will affect the European Union?
It's like it's being compared to kind of the emotions of a breakup. So, and going through all those different emotions, from kind of pain and upset to acceptance, to maybe kind of almost boredom, really. You know, that many MEPs I speak to from different countries in Europe are really quite fed up with Brexit. They're aware that they've got other issues that they want to be talking about, and this obsession with the UK is really holding things back. They want to be talking about the migrant crisis, they want to be talking about the environment, a whole raft of other issues, and yet every time they have to come back to the UK, is it staying, is it going? So there is a lot of frustration, I think, at the moment, and we might see that again in these elections.
Have they mentally said their goodbyes then, and Britain just aren't going? Do you think they might hope that we stay?
Well, I think for the British MEPs, it was really difficult when they had their last session in Strasbourg just a few weeks ago, because they didn't know whether they were saying goodbye for the last time. Some of them have been here for decades, and potentially saying goodbye to friends. Elections are always unpredictable for politicians and their staff, of course, as well. They never know if they're for sure going to be coming back here.
You'll be here on election night, will you, on the results night? What do you expect to see? Really buzzing with people? Will a lot of people come over here?
Yeah, the atmosphere is really electric on results night. Obviously, all the results are happening in different countries, so people are also at the counts all over Europe. But in that hemicycle in the debating chamber, you get the results coming in live from all over Europe, and the journalists here from all 28 European countries, and also countries from around the world. Press and media from around the world that are taking an interest too. So you get a real sense of kind of there's something happening here, and as you get the picture comes in of what's happening, what's happened in this election, then you get a buzz there as well. Yeah, it's an exciting place to be.
So this is the impressive hemicycle where Parliament usually sits when it's in session. But as you can see, at the moment, the stage is being set for the European elections. It's a huge operation and there are workers all over the place. There's going to be a huge panoramic screen going across that stage, and all the focus of Europe will be right there where the results will be coming in. But rather than being filled with 751 MEPs, this place will be filled with journalists.
EU member states must choose a system of proportional representation to vote in their MEPs. The UK uses the D'Hondt system. This is where the party with the most votes automatically wins a seat for the candidate at the top of their party's list. Voting is done in rounds in a broadly proportional way, allowing parties with lower initial totals to win seats. Once millions of EU citizens have cast their votes to select the 751 MEPs in the Parliament to represent them, another set of voting will take place, but this time it's behind closed doors. The EU's top jobs are up for grabs: the President of the European Commission, the President of the European Parliament, and the President of the European Council. Slightly awkward, but because Britain is still in the EU, it will also have a say.
What you have here is 28 countries coming together with all their different cultures, all their different languages, all the different political groupings, and yet 99.9% of the time we're able to find a compromise on legislation, on laws that work. And I think that's absolutely brilliant. On a particular day in the European Parliament, you have the MEPs meeting in committees or in their political groups. You have journalists walking around, staff, civil servants, also representatives of interest groups. So lots and lots and lots of people going around. It's very busy, it's very hectic, and it's quite fun.
Le Parlement européen est ridicule, très ridicule. Je salue ceux qui se sont donné la peine d'être en salle. Mais le fait qu'une trentaine de députés assisent à ce débat démontre à suffisance que le Parlement n'est pas sérieux.
You describe a typical day. Sometimes we do see camera shots of the Parliament and it's fairly empty sometimes. Not many MEPs turn up. We've heard Jean-Claude Juncker describe it as being ridiculous sometimes. How does that get controlled?
Oh, but that's a huge misunderstanding. I'm really happy that I can talk about that. I mean, imagine you are an MEP and you're a specialist in transport. But there is a long debate about, say, Syria. Are you going to be in that debate? Or are you going to be in your office working with your assistants, working with other MEPs? Are you going to do a meeting with someone from the European Commission? That makes sense, far more than to sit in the chamber listening to a debate where you not have any real input. So that's why, and that goes for any parliament. Go and watch other debates in national parliaments and you will see when there's a very specialist debate that most of the MPs are doing something else, but they're working, they are working.
So it's not reflective then? It doesn't mean that they're sort of having a coffee somewhere in a bar, they're still working?
No, on the contrary, in Strasbourg it's really, really hectic. and there they have, because it's like a pressure cooker, everything comes together there because it's a final vote. So you will see the MEPs, their staff, the administration staff, you see people from the Commission, people from the Council, the Presidency, journalists, still interest groups. So everybody is together, and there is tens, dozens, hundreds of meetings in one particular day. So it's extremely hectic, and you simply cannot afford to be in the plenary chamber the entire day. You cannot afford to do that.
MEPs do get a bit of a bad press, though, don't they? And we see that at the elections, the European Parliament elections, voter turnout is usually quite poor. I think it was the lowest ever last time round in 2014. Is that a concern, do you think, for the Parliament? Are you not engaging? Are the MEPs not engaging maybe with their citizens that they represent?
But I think there is very different reasons for that relatively low turnout. It's still higher than in some elections in the EU. But yeah, it is of course a concern, and we are trying to raise that turnout at the moment in our election campaign by trying to mobilize people who are interested.
We want to listen to the many voices.
Seen the division in the UK Brexit has wrought. What about here at the European Parliament? You describe Brexit as a crisis. Is it a crisis for the European Union?
Well, it's not a crisis for the European Union, to be quite honestly. I think it's more a crisis for British politics. What you see happening in the UK looks a bit like a meltdown there. But of course, nobody is happy in the EU. The UK is an important partner. And we hope it will continue to be an important partner. And as such, of course, it is a big shame that it is leaving. So in that sense, yes.
You can't help keeping your eyes peeled in case someone interesting walks by. And sure enough, I spot the outspoken Brexit Co-ordinator Guy Verhofstadt heading my way. I make a beeline towards him, but he politely declined my request for an interview. Oh well, it was worth a try. Conservative MEP Dan Dalton, on the other hand, was happy to speak to me.
Well, it's been difficult. I mean, Brexit happened only about 2 years after I got elected as an MEP, and it changed everything because immediately we were now on the outside, and it was sort of 27 against the British MEPs. As I was on the Remain side, I think I've been treated a little bit better. I'm still able to work with the other MEPs, mainly because we still have a vote, and that is still vitally important. But there's no doubt the situation has changed, and as we've got closer to the exit date, I think it's become very much sort of, you know, you were yesterday's people and now we're going to move on without you.
Is that the approach you're feeling from other MEPs then? They sort of overlook you now, possibly because they know that you're no longer going to be here?
Yeah, I think whilst we still had a vote, we were obviously important. I think now everyone's focusing on the elections and the new commission, which isn't going to take place with the UK, probably. Then, you know, I think things are looking differently and we're beginning to be pushed aside. But we've got good relationships with lots of other MEPs from other countries, and we've continued to work on those relationships. But you can't escape the fact that we're moving towards the door, and as a result, people are looking to move ahead without us.
How do you think these negotiations have gone?
Well, it's been difficult. In my opinion, it's been difficult because the EU has also taken quite a rigid negotiating position and not being prepared to move from it. From what I can see, it doesn't really matter who'd done the negotiations from the UK side. We would have been corralled into this position we're in at the moment, which in my opinion is a very uncomfortable position for the UK to be in. It's very difficult choices from here. So the negotiations haven't gone well, but I don't think they would have been any different if they'd been done by anyone else or in any other circumstances. This is how the EU does business, I'm afraid. I think there's no doubt that people are frustrated. People are very, very frustrated that we haven't left the EU already and that the deal isn't over the line and we're not moving forward to the next stage. And I think it's clear, you see from the polls that Nigel Farage's Brexit party are doing quite well. And I think there is certainly that frustration. This was the region that voted most heavily for Brexit of all the regions in the UK, and I think people want to see Brexit happen. So we have some challenges there, but I mean the position I'm always giving from the Conservative Party is that we are the party that is going to try and deliver Brexit. We will deliver Brexit. We just need a little bit more time because we don't have the majority in Parliament to get it through.
Do you think there should be a second referendum?
No, I'm uncomfortable about a second referendum, to be honest, because I think if you have the result, you have a referendum and you have a result that was delivered, it was a decisive result, it was close, but it was decisive. I think we've got to try and deliver on that result. But we've got to deliver it in a way that doesn't completely undermine all the relationships that we have at the moment between the two. And I think that, to me, that's the most important thing. We need to get a deal over the line that allows us to move to the next stage, and then we can go from there.
What happens if that deal doesn't go over the line? What happens then?
Well, then we're in, anything is on the table, to be honest, from that stage.
Default no-deal Brexit?
I think a no-deal Brexit is unlikely, to be honest, because I don't see how, I don't see that it will be beneficial for any side. I think it's potentially existential for both sides. So I think in the end you won't have a no-deal Brexit. We're going to have to wait. Anything's up in the air. If we don't get a deal agreed, everything is on the table at that stage.
Well, you were on the Labour committee with Claude Moraes that picked up on the language being used describing Gibraltar as a colony. Tell us, what was that like?
I think there was misunderstandings here on how divisive and how difficult this language was for the UK and for Gibraltar. I think people here, especially non-Spanish MEPs, didn't really understand it. They just saw the position that was put forward by, effectively pushed by the Spanish, and they were like, well, that's an EU position, so we'll go with it. And when I was trying to explain to them, and Claude as well was trying to explain to them just how divisive this language is, I think then they began to understand it. But the fact was then they were already behind the position. As you know, in Gibraltar, the majority of people voted very strongly to stay in the EU. They're very supportive of the EU. Yet for the EU and for other countries to start rowing behind effectively a Spanish position on Gibraltar, I think was very disappointing, not just for the European Union as a whole, an organisation that claims to respect human rights, rule of law and self-determination, that they're actually rowing completely against this in their own backyard. And I think that was actually the real problem with this issue. And I think Europe's going to find that the repercussions of this going forward are much worse for them than they thought, because that message about a Europe of freedom that they're sending out is being undermined in their own backyard.
I think the European Union should have been a lot more flexible. To be fair, I don't think Team Barnier have done a bad job, but particularly when it comes to the so-called backstop, the arrangement whereby Britain would remain in the same customs regime as the EU until further notice, until the EU lifts its veto over Britain recovering its own trade policy. I think that is quite an excessive arrangement, excessively balanced in favor of the EU, and I think both sides, Theresa May and the EU, should have known that this would have been very hard to sell in Britain.
Do you think Spain will continue to push its own political agenda in the next phase of Brexit negotiations when we get there, the future relationship between the UK and the European Union? And do you think that could be an obstacle?
I think Spain will continue to do this. I mean, relations were not optimal even when the UK was a member state of the EU. We've seen that Spain was willing to hold up an agreement on something as sensitive as citizens' rights, simply because it was sticking to the demand of some paragraph where the UK was described, or where Gibraltar was described as a colony. So I think the Spanish government, from both the left and the right, are quite aggressive on this issue. Which is another reason why we need to have a friendly Brexit, because the more unfriendly Brexit will be, I think the more aggressive Spain will be in its approach towards Gibraltar.
Do you think these European elections are the most important yet, particularly as we've seen a rise of far-right parties in Europe?
The direct effect will be all in all limited, because the sort of anti-establishment or Eurosceptic parties will still at the maximum have 1/3 of the seats in the European Parliament. Now, if particularly in Britain you would see a massive victory of the Brexit Party, for example, of the Eurosceptic forces, then I think you can imagine a scenario where the UK government would have less room to make compromises, which would of course complicate everything even more. So indirectly these elections may well have quite an impact on the negotiations.
How many seats would these far-right parties, these nationalistic parties, need to gain in the European Parliament for it to really start to become a problem?
Oh, I think you would need to get close to 40%. You would need to get close to a situation where sort of the more mainstream parties need you in order to appoint the new Commission President. But we're quite far from that. The centrist EPP and the left-wing socialists, they likely will not have a majority, but it's pretty certain that they will work with Emmanuel Macron's EU federalist group. And if that wouldn't work, I'm sure they would take the Greens on board. Yeah, they have many options to avoid having to cooperate with the Eurosceptics.
People are recognizing more and more that Brexit is not as easy as they thought it would be. And I talk to a lot of people who voted to leave and who've changed their minds. So yes, I am positive we need another referendum. We need a people's vote to make this happen. And I believe we now have the majority in Parliament to make that happen.
Well, how much of a difference can you make given that you may only have 4 months in the European Parliament if you're elected?
Well, of course, the hope is that we will be there for the entire 5 years and not just for 4 months. I mean, that is the main reason why I'm running. The reason why Liberal Democrats are running is to stop Brexit. But even if, in the worst case scenario, Britain does leave by the end of October, I think the impact we can make is to show that Britain is not represented only by Nigel Farage and his people, but is represented by some very, very enthusiastic pro-European people who want to keep Britain at the heart of Europe.
Now, realistically speaking, do you think Brexit can be stopped at this stage?
Yes, realistically speaking, today I believe it can be stopped. And I'm more optimistic today than I was a month ago or even 4 days ago. I think really the tide has turned in the whole of Britain. People are recognizing more and more that Brexit is not as easy as they thought it would be. And I talk to a lot of people who voted to leave and who've changed their minds. So yes, I am positive we need another referendum. We need a people's vote to make this happen. And I believe we now have the majority in Parliament to make that happen.
I don't want to burst your bubble about the local elections because obviously it was a fantastic night for the Lib Dems. But is it not more possibly a reaction of the public towards the way the Tories and Labour are handling Brexit at the moment? Because if you look at the polling, the Brexit Party seems to be in the lead.
Well, it's true that, of course, Leavers rally around the Brexit Party, but don't forget we have at least 3 Remain parties that are standing, and I'm not counting Labour because sadly, very sadly, Labour has now de facto become a Leave party. And we as Liberal Democrats would have very much liked to see one Remain voice. We do now have 3 Remain voices.
Why has that not happened?
Well, firstly, of course, it was too late for the Electoral Commission to allow a joint ticket. We ran out of time. Liberal Democrats have offered to both the Greens and Change UK to work together, to not attack each other. Unfortunately, that offer was declined. I think we should speak with one voice. And of course, as Liberal Democrats, we are the main Remain party, and we're hoping that voters will recognise that based on the success we had in local elections.
OK, so you're gunning for a second referendum then?
We are. I think that is the only realistic way to reach our ultimate goal, which is to stop Brexit.
And will you come and visit us in Gibraltar?
I will, absolutely. I've never been to Gibraltar. I hear it's very beautiful. And yeah, I look forward to that visit.
Me? Do you mind if I ask you what you think about Brexit? No? You don't like it? Okay, all right. Okay, very difficult at the moment to get some opinions. Let's try over here.
I wanted to see what the local people thought about Brexit, but I had to move away from the European Quarter where the main EU buildings are before I could find someone who would speak to me.
We hope it ends, that it just flushes out and that it never happens.
So you
I
hope,
think that's my opinion, of course.
you hope Britain will stay in the European Union?
Yeah, I hope so.
Can I ask you what you think about Brexit?
I think it's not a good idea.
It's not a good idea. Would you like Britain to change its decision?
Yes. It's not a good idea for the English, I think.
For me, the whole community with English in Europe is good.
Yes.
It's the best.
Together.
For me, yes, normally it's the best.
For us, it's a quite different story as for the people in Great Britain. And you can see a lot of people that I really don't like the Brexit, and yeah.
And even in England itself, there are different opinions. It has always been like that, and maybe there will be another curriculum, and maybe then.
Do you think the EU will welcome the UK just stopping it?
I think we will welcome them. We like the English, so they're special. They have always been special, but we want them back.
Gibraltar voted overwhelmingly in favour of remaining in the European Union during the 2016 referendum, but Britain voted out. Negotiations for the UK's withdrawal agreement have seen tensions rise between Gibraltar and Spain. So what's it been like for those on the front line?
The Gibraltar government opened its office here in Brussels in 1997, but it wasn't until 2015 that it decided to expand its operations because of the growing impact of EU influence on Gibraltar. And so the government acquired this 5-storey house here in Place Ambiorix, and it's not too far from the European Parliament, and just across the square there is the European Commission. But who would have foreseen that just a year later, in 2016, the UK would vote to leave the European Union? So what happens now here at Gibraltar House? I'm here to find out. Hello.
Hi Ros, how are you doing?
Nice to meet you.
Welcome to Gibraltar House.
Thank you, let's go in.
Welcome home. So the office, it's become Gibraltar's eyes and ears here in Brussels, and it serves as a platform from which to defend Gibraltar's interests right at the heart of the European Union. So a lot of our day-to-day work involves a lot of interaction with the EU's 3 main institutions, those being the Council, the Commission and the Parliament, and we have to ensure that Gibraltar is properly understood in those circles. So therefore, I mean, on a day-to-day basis, we're lobbying MEPs and their staff, we're speaking to Commission officials, we're speaking to diplomats who work in the member state representations, and we're engaging not only with those institutions, but also NGOs based here in Brussels and chambers of commerce, for example, and other entities that are based here.
Has that really made a difference to awareness of Gibraltar's issues?
I would certainly argue that we've done a lot of good work in the last 4 years here in Brussels to ensure that the Gibraltar message is coming across. There's a lot of work that we do to, for example, combat and set the record straight in terms of many of the untruths that are told here in Brussels about Gibraltar, be it in the context of Brexit, for example, but also the sort of day-to-day business that Gibraltar faces at EU level on matters to do with taxation and ensuring that it's understood that Gibraltar's record of compliance with international tax standards is being kept in Gibraltar, on EU civil aviation measures, for example, on the border, on the environment, and all sorts of issues.
So what's the level of engagement with the other MEPs, and not necessarily British MEPs, but from other member states?
I'd say that the level of engagement is certainly very good. I mean, and as you said, not only with British MEPs, but also MEPs from all parts of the European Union and the 28 member states. But not only the MEPs, I mean, also with member state representations, with the Commission. So the level of engagement has been quite high, and over the years we've been able to secure, for example, meetings for Gibraltar ministers and Gibraltar government officials with top-level diplomats, top-level politicians and officials. So, for example, today it's not uncommon for a Gibraltar minister to come to Brussels and meet a member state ambassador or a commissioner. So for a small territory such as ours to be able to say that, I think it's very positive. It is.
I was going to say how different and perhaps maybe more difficult your work will be going forward once if Britain does leave the EU.
Mm-hmm. Certainly. I mean, there's a question of question marks revolving around the issue of influence. I mean, how can Gibraltar influence the European Union from a position where it's outside of the European Union? But look, there are examples of territories with populations not dissimilar to Gibraltar's, which are very active here in Brussels and are outside of the European Union. For example, the likes of Andorra, San Marino, Monaco. They have really active representations here in Brussels, and they do really good work, and they have very dynamic relationships with the institutions, and that's something which we could potentially aspire to post-Brexit.
The Gibraltar office in Brussels opened with longtime friend of the Rock, former Lib Dem MEP Sir Graham Watson at the helm. Sir Graham wasn't in Brussels during my short visit, but I was able to catch up with him in Gibraltar.
Sir Graham, it's really nice to meet you.
Nice to see you.
Tell me, what's it been like outside the European Parliament these past 5 years?
Well, it's been a different experience. I had the honour of serving for 20 years and serving in reasonably senior positions. Coming out, of course, you are known, you have a sense of perspective which you don't have at the start. It's been very interesting to follow the European Union, but of course at a time which has been extremely difficult, and particularly for Brits with the whole Brexit affair.
Well, you have headed up the Gibraltar office in Brussels now for the past 4 years. Can you tell us, how has it been like lobbying for Gibraltar?
I've been very pleased in one sense to continue some of the work I was doing as an MEP in promoting knowledge of Gibraltar, understanding of Gibraltar, and promoting Gibraltar's interests in the European Union. But of course, it's very difficult when you do it officially for the government. We have an office with a small staff. We work as the official representative office of Gibraltar to the European Union. We deal with people of all parties. We deal with all of the institutions, the European Commission, the European Council, the European Parliament, and we facilitate visits for ministers from Gibraltar to Brussels, and of course visits for members of Parliament and others from the European Union to Gibraltar.
But how easy or how difficult has it been getting Gibraltar's voice heard?
I think you have to divide that into two periods. Prior to the Brexit referendum, Gibraltar was, of course, well represented and seen as a member of the European Union, a continuing part of the European Union, and so on and so forth. Since the Brexit referendum, everybody said, well, the UK is leaving and Gibraltar is leaving with the UK, and things have been very, very different. You cannot imagine what a change it has been. It's been like day and night. And we found ourselves in a situation where Spain can lobby for its interests, and the United Kingdom has no friends to stand up for it or for Gibraltar.
Let's just talk about the elections at the moment, because we're very focused on it. It's possibly the last time the UK and Gibraltar will take part in these European elections.
To me, the great one was the 2004 election, because it was the first election after the Matthews case in which Gibraltar had the right to vote and the right to be represented in the European Parliament. This is one where, sadly, we may find that it's the last time that people in Gibraltar have the right to vote. I regret that. But of course, it is seen as against a wider context in which the European Union is finding a lot of its traditional parties swept aside by new types of populist, sometimes extremist political parties. I think of people like Mr. Salvini and his league in Italy, people like Viktor Orban in Hungary, people like Nigel Farage and the Brexit Party in the UK. And I think there is a concern that European democracy is going through a very troubled period where it's very difficult to predict outcomes when we'll have a lot of new MEPs and a lot of people who perhaps don't follow the same democratic rules as their predecessors.
Of course, they're also going to be electing new leaders for the various institutions. Am I allowed to ask you who your tip for the top is at the Commission?
I think it's very difficult to say who will get it. Last time around, each party put up their own candidate, their own lead candidate, and Jean-Claude Juncker, who was appointed Commission President, was the candidate of the party that polled most votes in the elections. This time, some of the parties have decided not to do that, Some of the member states have objected to the process. And I think it will be a case of the heads of state and government coming together after the European elections, deciding on a nominee, putting that nominee to the European Parliament and the European Parliament approving. Who are those most likely to be? Well, Manfred Weber is the official nominee of the European People's Party, likely perhaps still to be the largest party. Frans Timmermans for the Socialists, Margrethe Vestager, a very, very strong woman commissioner for the Liberals.
For Gibraltar and the UK, which one of those three do you think would be the best choice? Because, of course, Manfred Weber has said we are with Spain, hasn't he, in the past? Which one do you think would be the best choice from our point of view?
Spain has a very, very strong representation and lobby within the European People's Party, and it has been the most difficult, if you like, representing Gibraltar to fight. I think we will have to work with whoever is elected. Fortunately, none of the likely candidates is Spanish. I think that's a good thing for Gibraltar.
I think Josep Borrell is being touted as a vice president, possibly of the Commission.
Josep Borrell has been touted either as a vice president or possibly as the High Representative for Foreign Affairs, but he's one among many candidates, and I'm not sure he's that strong a candidate in this. I'm pleased to say that as Spanish politicians go, he's one of the few who has been to Gibraltar, I believe. He is aware of the issue and is not quite as one-sided as some of those we've had to work with. I think of people like Mr. Garcia Margallo, for example. But we will have to continue our efforts to promote Gibraltar's interests and the rights of Gibraltar's people, whoever is selected for the top job. And that will mean talking not only to them and their staff, but to all of the commissioners on the sectoral issues which are of importance to Gibraltar.
I think the Gibraltar office has played a fundamental role in representing the interests of Gibraltar before the European Union. We've built up a considerable amount of goodwill and, as I said, a considerable amount of relationships with different members of the European Parliament. And you see that in some of the votes that have taken place, because even in that vote on the visa regulation, where the term colony was used in a footnote in reference to Gibraltar, even in that vote, Gibraltar obtained over 200 MPs of different nationalities and different political groups who are willing to support us on that particular regulation. And it's happened in other votes. I mean, over the years, what you have seen is that from being in a position where we would automatically lose votes overwhelmingly, Gibraltar suddenly started winning votes in committees and also in the main plenary itself. But sadly, once we leave the European Union, we don't know what will become of that work. Certainly we intend to maintain an office there. There are other small territories not in the European Union who also maintain offices in Brussels. We think it's important. Europe will still be there and will still need to have a relationship with it.
So will the office remain there with the staff that it has? It's not going to downscale or anything?
The intention is for the office to remain exactly as it is. I mean, one of the things which they've done very well and very effectively, for example, is that they take on 2 interns for a period of, say, 3 or 4 months at a time. And these are nationals of different member states of the European Union. And they go on to work in embassies, in permanent reps, in the Parliament, in the Commission, in the Council. So we have contacts and people we know who might be helpful to Gibraltar in the future. That's one of the things which they've done, and I think it's worked very well, and I'd like to see that continue going forward.
How long do you think the office will remain open after Brexit?
It's impossible to say at this stage, but like I said, the policy of the government is to keep it open. We have no intention and no plans to close it. It served us extremely well throughout the time in the European Union. If Brexit happens and if we leave the European Union, and it's not very clear at the moment in which direction that is going to go, but if we do leave, I think there is still a political value in having an office before the EU.
In terms of the European elections, what do you think the best outcome for Gibraltar is?
Well, at the position of the government, as a government, is that we are not endorsing anybody in the European election. It's up to individuals to decide who it is that they want to vote for.
The composition of the EU with MEPs.
But as parties, obviously the Liberal Party in Gibraltar and the GSLP in Gibraltar have taken positions as to who it is that they would support or would endorse in the election. But bear in mind, the largest single party bloc in the European Parliament is the European People's Party. and they have more MEPs than anybody else. Traditionally, we don't know what will happen this time round, but traditionally that has been the case. The problem for Gibraltar has been that in that largest single party bloc, there are no British members of the European Parliament. Once David Cameron took the decision to pull out the Conservatives from the European People's Party and to join the ECR group instead, which is a smaller group which contains Poles and some other nationalities, it meant that there is no British voice, or there was no British voice in the largest single bloc in the European Parliament, which explains why, although Gibraltar, in different votes in the Parliament over the years, has managed to attract support across a large number of political groups, sometimes even a majority of political groups, it has been working with the European People's Party, which has a large representation from Spain, from the Partido Popular. That has been very difficult.
I decided to spend the afternoon at a European Policy Centre event at the Crowne Plaza Hotel. It was called Yes We Should, an EU action plan for the next 5 years. I wanted to find out what the EU's priorities were and how Brexit might affect the bloc going forward. There were some very notable speakers, the President of Croatia one of them. Topics included sustainable prosperity, security, jobs, investment and growth, and also crises affecting the countries in the EU, such as poverty, migration and climate change. The EU 27 may each have diverse views on all of these areas, but the political will to improve them is shared by all. The EU is powering forward, and it began to dawn on me that Britain and Gibraltar will soon no longer be part of the dialogue. In fact, Brexit was barely mentioned during the first discussion, except as an obstacle to future plans. But delve deeper, and there is much regret too. Janis Potočnik is Slovenia's former Minister for Foreign Affairs and also a former European Commissioner for the Environment.
It's actually in many ways, it's sad that such kind of a decision was reached after so many years. It's sad for the British citizens as well as for European. But the major thing which really is the sad part of that story is, we are living in a world which is for the first time very much interconnected, interdependent. We really depend on each other. And in these times we would need more cooperation to solve some of the major issues like climate change, like biodiversity loss, like migration and so on. And in that context we would need more sharing of the sovereignty and less owing of the sovereignty, something like it was done by the European Union decades ago. And going in the different direction, it's just the opposite, like the whole world would need to go, because more cooperation and more joint decisions is a must.
You also said it was tragic for the environment. Can you explain that?
Yeah, I don't know if it's really tragic for environment, but I think the whole story, as I said, it's tragical, but depends a lot how actually the rules will be undertaken and also implemented in the future in United Kingdom. But I can say that it's always easier when you have joint rules, when they are jointly followed, when they are asking everybody to commit. And I have to say that Britain in many times, United Kingdom in many times was very active partner, which I have been very much appreciating. I was before also the Commissioner for Science and Research, and I can tell you that if somewhere United Kingdom was really benefiting, it was in the science and research, financially and also from the point of view of the cooperation, which in science it's fundamental.
Do you think Britain as well will lose out by not being part of that anymore?
Of course. It will lose out because today, if you say science, you basically say being regionally, nationally active, connected to the European and global researchers, and that's the way how the science works. And with the tools which are existing on the European Union level, I just hope that there will be an agreement that this cooperation continues. I was before also the Commissioner for Science and Research, and I can tell you that if somewhere United Kingdom was really benefiting, it was in the science and research, financially and also from the point of view of the cooperation, which in science it's fundamental.
Do you think Britain as well will lose out by not being part of that anymore?
Of course. it will lose out because today, if you say science, you basically say being regionally, nationally active, connected to the European and global researchers, and that's the way how the science works. And with the tools which are existing on the European Union level, I just hope that there will be an agreement that this cooperation continues.
I had to say goodbye to my cameraman Francesco late in the afternoon, but there was one more EPC discussion I wanted to stay for. So I discreetly wormed my way to a front seat in the auditorium and whipped out my mobile phone for Guy Verhofstadt's hard talk. The European Parliament's Brexit negotiator talked about the type of reforms he would like to see in the EU, such as removing each member's veto and voting on qualified majority instead. But he's always good for a dramatic Brexit soundbite. And I wasn't disappointed.
In every other country, you should have seen the emergence of a cross-party platform putting together opposition and majority and saying, how are we going to deal with this? The people have spoken, they have done a referendum. How we will translate that in reality? That would be in every country, even in this country, a cross-party business platform created for that. In Britain, it's exactly the opposite. There, they have continued to use Brexit as a bullet in a weapon to kill each other.
Guy Verhofstadt is more outspoken than some of his colleagues at the EU, but there's no doubt that Brexit has cast a shadow over this year's elections.
The European Policy Centre is one of Europe's most influential think tanks, and the event here at the Crowne Plaza Hotel underlines the point that despite Brexit, it's very much business as usual for the European Union. Here they're talking about shaping and delivering policies over the next 5 years. But of course, Britain and Gibraltar won't be part of that, although it must be said, with these elections coming up, it offers Britain a chance to keep one foot in the door. And certainly from speaking to people here in Brussels today, the door remains very much open. This is Ros Astengo for GBC News in Brussels.
After a long day, it was time to prepare to go home. It's clear that whichever way the political landscape is shaped in the coming months, the challenges faced by all will continue for many years to come.